Shall I begin? Are we live, Inez?
Yes, we are. You've got people joining. You've got about 32 people right now. So people are starting to come in.
All right. Let's get started. Welcome to the 2021 Houston Bike Summit. My name is Joe Cutrufo, and I'm the Executive Director of Bike Houston. It's so exciting to see such a great turnout for today's panel, which brings together a mix of local and national experts in transportation policy, street design, and community development for an honest conversation on how to make Houston a city that doesn't simply tolerate, but one that fully embraces the bicycle as a mode of transportation. Houston's come a long way, even in just the last few years, but there's a lot of work to be done if we're serious about building out the Houston Bike Plan, achieving the goals of the Vision Zero Action Plan, and making it possible for all Houstonians, regardless of who they are or where they live, to safely and easily get around their city on a bike. Thank you all so much for joining us today for what I'm sure is going to be a conversation full of insights and ideas. Before I pass the mic over to Veronica Davis, who will introduce our moderator, I'd like to acknowledge Link Houston and Houston B-Cycle, who are co-producing the Houston Bike Summit this year. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Traffic Engineers, Inc., Edo Bike Co., Darrow, and Bike Barn for their support. Next up is Veronica Davis, who will introduce our moderator. Veronica is Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations at Houston Public Works and an advocate for equitable bike-friendly streets. And I'll add, she testified before Congress this morning at a Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee hearing on transportation equity. Good afternoon, Veronica.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for attending this important summit. As you all know, Mayor Turner has called for a paradigm shift. And that means as we look to the future, everyone cannot drive their vehicle alone. Otherwise, we will become a true city of highways. And as part of Mayor Turner's commitment, he brought in David Fields, who's the Chief Transportation Planner, and David does not drive. He brought in myself over the Director of Transportation and Drainage. I'm also the co-founder of Black Women Bike. So it's not just about being an engineer. I am a person who bikes as a form of transportation and believes that a bike is a form of freedom. As you know, we have our Vision Zero plan. And so our goal by 2030 is to have zero traffic related deaths and serious injuries. And so what this means that we're doing as a city is really prioritizing increasing safety. And I will say we do need your help. We're unable to be everywhere. This is a large city. So please put in 311 requests. We have been addressing them to make sure that we're maintaining the bike infrastructure that we are putting in. But in addition, we are getting really excited to put in new bike infrastructure. And right now for the city, our default is high comfort bike lanes, and then if that is unable to fit, we will move to something else. And then lastly is our complete communities. And that is our investment in areas that have been disinvested and under-resourced. And with that, even now we have the Hillcroft project, which will be putting in high comfort bike lanes through one of our complete communities. And so for us, equity is also about the bike. But with that, it is my honor to introduce Doug Gordon. He is the Brooklyn-based writer, TV producer, safe streets advocate, and passionate believer in cities for people. He's written for The New Republic, Salon, Curved, and Streets blog, and he's the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts, The War on Cars. As a TV producer with credits with PBS, ABC, Discovery, History, Travel, and Nat Geo, Doug knows how to tell a good story. He's advised nonprofits and mobility companies on media and communication strategies that make the case for smarter streets. People for Bikes call him a master of images that subvert anti-bike stereotypes. Please welcome Doug, and thank you for being a part of the City of Houston's Bike Summit.
Thanks, Veronica. That's an awesome intro. And I was so excited when Joe told me you'd be introducing me because you're like a rock star to me. So I really appreciate that. A quick note about the name of the podcast for people who don't know, The War on Cars. I'm sure people who are fighting for safer streets in Houston know that if you take like one parking spot and turn it into bike parking or an expanded bus stop, people will accuse you of waging a war on cars. So that's what we mean by the title of our podcast. We are not actually waging a war on cars. We are sensitive to the need for cars, especially in cities like Houston, but kind of want to point towards a better, more equitable, more sustainable future. We actually just did an episode where we mentioned Lena Hidalgo and the fight against I-45, the widening there. If you're watching, please come on the podcast. We would love to get her. And we're really interested in the stuff that's happening in cities like Houston. Very quickly, my last visit to Houston was in 2008, I think about 4 weeks after Hurricane Ike. And I remember being downtown and seeing like buildings boarded up and crews still cleaning up. It was just when I was getting involved in Safe Streets advocacy. And I remember looking around and being a New Yorker where you often hear that our streets are too narrow for bike lanes. And I was downtown where you have these really wide one-way arterial 4 or 5 lane roads. And I was like, wow, there's so much they could be doing here. And I know that in the time since I've been there, a lot of great stuff has been happening. And we'll get into that. So I wanted to give our panelists each just a very quick 2 or 3 minutes to introduce themselves. We have ZabeBent, who's the Director of Design at NACTO, Veronica Chapa Gorczynski, the Executive Director of the East End District, Nikki Knight, who's the Senior Projects Manager for Greater Southeast Management District, and Bill Nesper, who's the Executive Director of the League of American Cyclists. I'm just going to go in the sort of Brady Bunch square order that I see. So let's start with our national panelists first. So Bill, do you mind introducing yourself first?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Doug. And big thanks to Bike Houston for inviting me. And it's great to be part of this panel, this opportunity to speak about this really important subject. I'm the Executive Director of the League of American Bicyclists, as Doug said. I hope that this convening of folks listening will be inspired to act wherever they have influence to make bicycling better for all. We know bicycling brings people together, brought us here today, and we know that through bicycling we can help talk about, of course, and act on making the lives of the people in Houston better. So for those of you who don't know us, just real quick, the League of American Bicyclists, since 1880, we've been the national organization protecting the rights of people who bike and promoting bicycling for transportation and good health and the freedom it brings. We like to say that the bicycle isn't just the best vehicle ever invented. Bicycling is a simple solution to many of the challenges that we face in our communities, in our country and world. And we know that, I don't know if you all know this, but the league is really made up of people like Bike Houston and people in the room who are really, we're an organization of organizations. So 200,000 members and supporters. We're an advocacy organization and 1,000 state and local organizations. So partners like Bike Texas and Bike Houston are our partners at the local level. So we together want to be transforming lives and communities through bicycling. And our mission is to build a bicycle-friendly for America for everyone. And it's really important. I just want to note that for everyone is really important as a lens through which we look at all of our work. A few years back, we added those words to our mission. And it's critical that both in our thoughts and our visioning and our actions that we're taking, we're making sure that bicycling is better for all. And I think, you say that's in the title of this. As you say, it's a car town. We hope we can help move the needle on that. It's our hope as a national bicycling organization to help you benchmark and build and to evaluate, use our bicycle friendly community program. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. We have a little bit of experience with your good work there in Houston, and to support the people who are advocating for and developing the bike network, delivering on bike education, giving people the skills and confidence to ride, to support the individuals and groups that are providing access to bikes and people to bike with, to keep that Houston bike culture thriving and growing. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and digging into what that actually means and what can be done. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Bill. Zabe, why don't you go next?
Okay. So hi, everyone, and thanks again to Bike Houston for convening this discussion and inviting me to join. I'm ZabeBent. I'm the Director of Design at NACTO, which is a national membership organization of more than 80 city transportation and transit agencies. We're probably best known for our Urban Street Design Guide and the Urban Bikeway Guide, and more recently for the Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. And much of my work focuses on the technical underpinnings of that sort of guidance. but also, and maybe even most importantly, at least for this discussion, is how to connect the guidance around safety and sustainability and equity to implementation. Because in truth, I personally believe that most engineers and designers actually know how to build or design a bikeway or a bike lane. The difficulty is often how to manage the trade-offs and the priorities in a constrained environment or with constrained resources. So often that boils down to making sure that our street network and our policies align, because street design and network design, in my opinion, are physical manifestations of our policies. So my work centers all of those connections, and I'm really excited to dive into this conversation because safe, sustainable, and equitable design, it should be the norm. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Zabe. Veronica, you can go next.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and for Bike Houston for helping to put all of this together. I'm Veronica Chapa Gorczynski, and I have the honor of being the leader at the East End District, which is a management district, otherwise known as a business improvement district. We have about 16 square miles between downtown and Port of Houston. And so the significance of this is we have about 75,000 residents, 3,500 businesses. And in this role, I have found myself advocating multimodal transportation options, including access to bikeways. So I know we'll get more into the discussion. I'm excited about it, but what I'm excited about and proud of our work currently is the eastendbikeplan.com. So our business improvement district was partnered with our Harris County Commissioner Precinct 2, Adrian Garcia, was very generous, and we are collaborating for our area of town, putting together our own bike plan. And taking a lot of input from residents, businesses, partners to see what we could do to think about this area differently and planning for kind of the next phase of our development in the community. So I look forward to talking to all of you. What an amazing panel of rock stars. I'm honored and humbled and excited for the conversation ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Veronica. Nikki, why don't you go next? I forgot to mention that you're also, Nikki, on the board of directors of Bike Houston.
Yeah, so that's new. That's a new thing. So again, that's been an honor, absolutely. Also working with the management district, we manage about 30 square miles of the city south of downtown, including the medical center, universities, museum district, OST Palm Center, McGregor, just a whole network of neighborhood streets. We also have some major thoroughfares that we're working to navigate so that we can have safer streets for all travelers, right? But really looking deeply into how to incorporate bike safety and pedestrian safety into how people move in, through, and around our district. We recently put down our Houston Southeast Neighborhood Greenways, which connects to neighborhood parks using neighborhood streets. We input a median refuge as well as signage and ADA compliant ramps, and just making sure that people understand that connectivity is key. Also working with Houston Bike Share to install 3 new stations in an area where no stations exist, which is the OST Palm Center area, to start a micro network. And that's been an amazing journey because a lot of people who are avid riders and who want to see different areas of the city don't have a way to connect safely because they just don't know. The other piece is working with the City of Houston and Harris County Precinct 1, Commissioner Ellis's office, to implement the Houston Bike Plan. And that's been a huge undertaking because everybody does not understand the necessity of advocating and prioritizing bike safety because, you know, people are used to behavior. And behavior says, I drive my car and that's what matters. And so we have to shift behavior and we have to shift mindsets. And that's been a part of this work. And I'm grateful that I get to serve in that capacity. And then being able to see it from the side of Bike Houston on the advocacy side, you know, as a mom with some teenagers ready to get behind the wheel, I'm challenging them to look at transportation and modality very differently because of what they have access to. So I'm excited to be a part of this panel and I'm really excited to serve. So thank you guys.
Great. So I'm going to start with a really general question and we'll start with the locals. So it's a very easy question, but just so we can kind of define the terms that we're talking about here, what does it mean for you for Houston to become bike friendly? That's a very different definition, I think, than would mean where I live, where I have excellent transit down the street and bike lanes on nearly every corner, essentially. What does it mean for Houston to become bike friendly?
You want to go first, Veronica? Uh, I guess for me, for Houston to become bike friendly means for us to become aware and to become educated. I think that we've relied so heavily on vehicular transportation and public transit that we have not spent a lot of time navigating how they all intersect. We have a unique nexus of access, in our city. We have tons of freeways. We have, tons of ways to get everywhere. But on a bike, it is a little bit more difficult to get from one side of the city to the other. And so really education, bike friendliness starts with understanding. And I think that's what we have to get to first.
So, and Nikki, I agree with you. The only thing I would add is we need to work on safety. It's really hard driving, especially in the neighborhoods that you and I represent. There's a lot of ghost bikes painted where people, and we had a really tragic, we had a tragic accident, I think a couple of weeks ago even, that, was made it to the Chronicle and it was notable enough. So bike safety is critical, and it's not just about teaching people how to be safe on a bike, but that the neighborhood embraces it and slows down and understands that other people also have a right to be in the road. And it's not a game, and it can hurt people.
And I guess for Bill and Zabe, the question becomes, you both work with cities that are measured in population in, the low 100,000s to the high millions. And, what does it mean? How do you approach your work in a city like Houston compared to, let's say, a small Midwestern city or local neighborhoods or things like that?
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, that's a great question. I think, for those of you who don't know, we're working with communities all the way down to like 500 people, all the way up. I know NACTO, their work is more with larger cities, and I think that there's some fantastic examples of this. But I think no matter where you go, you have to meet people where they are. And I think what you both said about educating and putting safety first. I think a lot of this is about starting. Houston's a really, really big place that I think, I live in the Washington, D.C., I live in Arlington, Virginia, but I live in the metro area. I think the entire metro D.C. area, I really think of as like about the size of Houston, I think. And there's a lot of theirs there. And I think that in order to build the kind of political will that you need to implement your bike plan and get that comfortable network built out, it's going to take, figuring out where you can get support and making sure that that support is representative, of course, and in pushing, but I think no matter where you start, it has to be, I don't know, selling people or letting people see their own goals in your goal of bicycle friendliness. I think that the key thing is to not make it about the bike. It's got to be about people living great lives, and I think that's really at the core of this. I don't want to call it a sale and cheapen it, but making the case for this is about meeting people where they are and going, this is going to make X, Y, and Z better. And communities are, they're different in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of similarities no matter where you are, and a lot of things that can be learned.
Yeah, I agree with all of those things. I think figuring out what that means and how to do it is one thing, but I think even just conveying the idea that it should be safe to get around the city no matter how you travel is something to me that conveys bike friendliness or pedestrian safety or what have you. It should be safe, it should be convenient, it should be a realistic option. All of them should be on the table. And for a good while, that's probably going to mean setting up a paradigm where a complete street is the norm. It's the default when you design and plan and program, rather than an afterthought that you can get around. And so I think that really is the goal, is how do we center these until it becomes the default?
Great. And this is probably a question for Veronica to start off on. When I was in Houston, I know you have a really excellent network of off-street paths and parks. And that, as you mentioned, is starting to come onto the streets, and you've all these plans that are starting to be implemented. What challenges have you found in Houston making that jump from seeing bikes as a thing that belongs on a pathway or in a park for recreational cyclists to taking that onto the streets for real transportation?
Well, and I just want to clarify, was that question for me? Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
I think just because you have that, you were talking about the East End bike project, I thought like that might be a good place for us to dive into that a little bit.
Okay, fair enough. So let me start with a little bit, just a level set for people who maybe aren't from Houston. So the city's about what, 640 square miles, something like that. And I've been told that Harris County, with and without water, is the size of the state of Rhode Island. So that's why we're so highway centric or car centric in a lot of ways, because it takes a long time to just get out of Houston. So for us, I think where we started with the East End Bike Plan was we knew that there was a Houston Bike Plan. And then separately, there was a bond provision that allowed for a Bayou Greenway 2020 initiative that allowed us to connect green spaces to bikes. And then when you got to our 16 square miles, we felt that there wasn't a lot of connectivity. Like we were just missing the mark just a little bit. And you would talk to people and they would say, no, if you could just connect these two pieces, like it would just be a bigger picture. It would connect the neighborhood better. And so we're working on the East End Bike Plan, where we have our last community coming up here at the end of May. And we found 50 miles of high comfort and shared bikeways within our 16 square mile footprint that allowed for like connectivity going both east and west, which is just, you're wrapping your mind around that. And that is from community-based input. That is a lot of recommendations. So I think everybody wants high comfort because especially the newbies or where we have a lesser culture of biking, you feel safe if that's all you see. But we also are in this really interesting position on the East End where we have, like you mentioned earlier, I think your experiences in downtown, there's these really wide avenues and maybe we're not using them all. And maybe we could repurpose some of the one-way to two-way and allow for really nice dedicated bike lane that gives us north-south connection. So these are the possibilities that we're looking at. I think that, the concerns that we continue to get are about, one is safety. The other one is just simple things of notice and signage. We had, as a community, this really great dedicated bike path that actually went over a section of a street that went over I-10. And the interesting part was I felt like they had really indicated with the paint, they had put the barriers up. I was still going down the access road and saw a Suburban make a right turn onto that back path because that's what they were used to drive. That was their lane formerly, and trying to ride down the bike path to go up north. And so they're freaked out because, they're getting hit by the barriers on like both sides. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is not going to be a good thing. Keep going. I share that as emblematic of like what our problem is. And so I worry about that when I think about our little plan, I think about the Suburban because that could be the accident piece. So it's not just, it's comment, it's intentional design, which is why we have like these amazing people that have put these design guides in. But then, Bill, I think you're really great about reminding us that you got to talk to people. And in Houston, that means reaching people in multiple languages. This is not an English only space. And we have to acknowledge what the rules are and how they can stay safe in whatever language they primarily speak in.
Nikki, you want to go ahead?
I totally agree. It's definitely about the shared experience, and the experience in itself is universal, and the language barriers, the cultural barriers, the access to information and how people receive information. Since we've transitioned to a digital world, there are people who are still behind the cuff, and that digital divide is huge. And so in communicating and educating and advocating, we have to approach this thing from so many avenues so that we can communicate and live out those shared experiences. So I agree totally with you, Veronica. It's scary to not see signage and to see what could happen when people just don't pay attention. In our district, there's so many bike routes, but people don't know their bike routes because they drive 50 miles an hour down the bike route. And so they're not safe. And even with a marking, it's like, okay, I was here first and I'm the bigger vehicle. And so I'm primary. So being able to change, again, that mindset behavior and being able to allow people to, start to navigate toward a shared experience is huge.
And I'm wondering, we were talking a little bit, Veronica, you mentioned kind of like counting people and doing outreach to people in multiple languages. And, I think I promised Joe that I would not be like, well, in New York guy the whole time. But, in a really dense city, usually the way you get a bike infrastructure is that the Department of Transportation goes out and they count the number of cyclists who are currently using that street. And they say, well, we already have a lot of people using this. Let's make them safer. So let's put a bike lane here. In a city like Houston, where you have neighborhoods cut off by highways and all that kind of stuff, how do you make the case and how do you count people and reach out to people when in some ways, like they're either not there, right? Because the street's just too dangerous to bike on, or if they are there, maybe they're low income, maybe they don't have time to like fill out an online survey or something like that. They're just trying to get to work. So, what are your outreach efforts like? And, I think there are probably some lessons we can take nationally with that as well.
So we partnered with a great engineering firm, and I got to give kudos to TEI because I was pretty hard on them in the beginning and said, I want culturally competent outreach. So they actually had an outreach firm that helped us to figure this out. And the specific needle that we had to thread is people are at work during the day in our neighborhood. They're not walking around. So how do you get their input? And so the outreach firm went to different apartment complexes because there were people there that move around, try to see if we can survey them, and actually asked businesses, because I thought, well, if business owners, we're trying to get them to actually install bike racks because they're available for free. Could we offer this to your employees? So just ask the business owners, can we survey your employees and ask them? An important piece that I just tell people from a community development perspective is you can't always expect the written survey. That assumes a level of time and a level of literacy that people may not have for a variety of reasons. And it's not to say that people aren't knowledgeable or not smart. Again, you have to reach them where they're at. And so even having like the person who is going and doing the survey take it for them and help to swipe through the screens was helpful in us kind of truncating the amount of time that was spent on this, but also varying the types of the responses that we got. So I felt like that was incredibly helpful. And then we were very fortunate. We have a good network of neighborhood leaders. And, like Nikki does, we both have really good relationships with the neighborhood folks. And so it was contacting them, doing the meeting from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at night, understanding it's on Zoom, everyone's got kids, we're doing dinner, giving each other grace, but doing it to have a real conversation where you have the map that's shown that's more sophisticated and you talk about those hotspots, and even just fostering those types of discussions. And for us, we had them translated into Spanish. We either had the presentation available in Spanish or I was making remarks in Spanish. So if we had folks there that they were comfortable and included. And there was a little extra cost. It was more effort on our part. And it was effort that we wanted to do because we wanted to set the national example of like, this is how you reach out to rich and diverse communities. So we're really proud of the way we were able to get folks engaged. And just as a side note, we had another program that similarly did some outreach. We had really high response rates during the pandemic. People really were able to take time for us. And so that was kind of an added benefit.
Nikki, go ahead. I would love to hear what's working in your district.
So much like Veronica, we lean heavily on our businesses and community leaders. Our super neighborhoods do an amazing job of keeping everyone on their toes, making sure that, things that impact the neighborhoods are brought to the forefront with the greater good in mind. Because you have to have champions for the neighborhoods, especially for the amount of the city or the square footage of the city we serve. And most of the concerns, again, are not isolated. They're a shared experience. So what's happening in one area that may be economically, a bit more astute than another area, those shared experiences still exist, right? How do we make sure that people can get home safely? How can people walk their babies down the street on these sidewalks and not worry about having to walk around a hole or an unlevel sidewalk? How do we get people to leave their bikes safely parked in front of a business, or to travel from business to business or park to park and not feel as though they're having to, play Frogger to get across the street and, risk their lives to enjoy a day at the park? But outreach is, again, multifaceted. And so what we're doing is making sure that we communicate, we're providing, lifelines to say, hey, tell us what's going on, things that we may not see, and being able to then assure them that we're going to attack these things in partnership with them, because it's super important that there's a level of relationship and trust that's developed in order for us to get anything accomplished.
And Zabe and Bill, have there been good models that you've seen at the national level, small cities, big cities, that you really think shines?
Bill probably has a direct answer for this. I am going to go off book just for a second, because I think that we have this sort of obsession with numbers, and even when it comes to outreach, I really push back on that. I think data is not just hard numbers. It's not just quantifiable information. I think qualitative information is important, and especially when you're talking about reaching out to people about cycling, which in and of itself is already sort of seen as a second-class mode, and it's sort of, again, marginalized. We need to hear from marginalized voices. So when it comes to engagement, I think it is really critical to form a relationship and actually engage, not just push information out and get feedback on that specific thing, but really try to figure out what is the type of information we're trying to get, what kind of thing will enrich our project, because this is data that can be used to make the project better, and that could be at a plan level or an intersection level. The other thing is, I think it's important to talk to as many people as we can, but it's important to always ask who's not in the room, who's not in this space, who's not represented on this fact sheet or this data count, and focus on a diversity of voices, and specifically the voices in the corridor, in the neighborhood, as well as people who are using it to pass through to get to different places. And that has really changed between the pandemic and pre and wherever we're going, right? People are starting to remember that they can walk or bike to their neighborhood, fill in the blank, whatever it is, shop, restaurant, what have you. And it has really changed the way that people think about their neighborhood and how they access it. So again, a diversity of voices, early and often, and making sure that we are actually hearing people and engaging with them, not just pushing information out.
Yeah, and I was going to say, actually, I know that we talk a lot about these meetings that do happen from 6 to 8 p.m., but then that means that the person working a restaurant job, right, probably can't attend that meeting. But I will say on the flip side, some of the moving remote for me has meant that I can go to more meetings, right? Because I don't have to worry about childcare or leaving work at 5:30, which, I, in the normal times, have the luxury of doing. So yeah, Bill, I was wondering if you could kind of, I like that you went off book, Zabe. We should all do more of that. That's good. We need to hear the raw, unfiltered stuff. It's good. Bill, without losing your job, what can you say that will, expand on that?
I mean, I agree with what everybody said, and I'm glad to go off book. I think, this isn't rocket science, right? I think sometimes, it's, I think I heard, listen to people, keep listening, give as many opportunities for people to so you can hear them, but actually hear them. And we know that any relationship is iterative. This is not, I think, the city of Oakland went through a process during the pandemic of putting in a bunch of slow streets and other things. And then they were running off of what was a really well produced plan. But yet they halfway through, they realized, they had done the outreach, they had done the work to put together a really good plan. And as they were doing it, they realized, oh gosh, it's, listening is listening over and over again. I think I encourage folks to go out and look at that story. I think the planning director is Warren Logan, talk about it. But basically it's a process, and you have to keep listening and you have to keep changing and tweaking. But at the core of it, it has to be about, I think it has to be about access more than anything. I don't know if I put a priority up there. You're not, Doug, you brought up at the very beginning, counting people who are biking, and showing sort of, that's how you show demand. I think, we can learn about, people's access to destinations. Yes, Houston is a very big area, but we know that over 50% of trips in the United States are 3 miles or less. That's a 15-minute bike ride. So knowing that people have many, many destinations, and some of us have learned about all these other destinations close to us within a very short bike trip. I think learning about access and then the bike and transit and walking and micromobility are ways to help people get access to those places. I think that's approaching it that way in that listening process, and not, I mean, we're a biking organization. We love bikes. I like looking at bikes. I like talking about bikes. But you got to lead with the access to the things that people want to do, the people that they want to be with, the job that they need to get to, those sorts of things. I think that's how you measure it.
Yeah, and I will say, I think that, for me to go off book a little bit, in New York, there was an early focus on routes from core areas to the central business district. And then that just meant that we were prioritizing like the dude with his tech job, right? And we weren't thinking about, well, what about the caregiver who needs to take a child to school or visit someone, in a nursing home or take someone to the doctor. So yeah, I think that Zabe also had a great point of just like every street should be accessible. It should we should start with the default and then maybe work backwards from there if we have to, but start with the default of access. For Veronica and Nikki, I'm wondering, so Joe and I were talking, there's a sort of unique arrangement in Houston where you have these management districts, which is different from how it works in a lot of other cities, right? Where you might have a very powerful mayor who sort of issues bike plans or doesn't from a top-down perspective, but you have a lot of control in your districts that are different for people who are not elected in the same way. What do you think the advantages and disadvantages of the way things work in Houston are?
Well, I think my seat got really hot.
Yeah, I don't want you to lose your job either. So
no,
yeah.
Well, so here's what I would say is, I don't see myself as as a person having control. I'm just a caretaker and a leader. And we've got 16 square miles and a very large city and bureaucratic operation. And so that means I know when there's work on gas, electric, when there's infrastructure, when we're, if there's flooding, if there's tapping into sewer, if we need to upgrade the water, like these are all things that I keep track of and try to help move along. And so, I think the advantage to having someone like me that is a leader, but also a caretaker and has the responsibility of making sure that we do this right is that we get to see the larger city in a concentrated form. Like I have responsible for 16 square miles. Our biggest lines of business, so to speak, that we're most responsible for as a management district are safety and security. We do a lot in beautification and green space maintenance, and then maintaining the commercial corridors. Those are the bread and butter. The infrastructure piece comes along because it's one of those things where you walk down the sidewalk and you literally see the sidewalk ends. And it's like, how do we connect this piece of the sidewalk to that end of the sidewalk? And that's where Nikki and I start coming in. Especially I think for both the neighborhoods, and I don't want to speak for both of us, but something I want to highlight is, I think Doug, you're talking from like this New York sensibility where we have this density and a lot of people. And the area that I represent and that Nikki represents is a lot less dense, but we're going through this reinvestment of what for us, we were primarily industrial industry on your way to the port. And some very historic residential neighborhoods that were in place before the city of Houston was even here. Old Town Harrisburg, or like the neighborhood that's the Houston Heights in Eastwood, same developers that first came to this area. So the significance of that is we have a lot of different space considerations. We have a lot of environmental considerations. I have 2 bayous, technically 3 highways, and 1 main thoroughfare all around our district. And then, at the end of the day, if we say it's about people, there's about 75,000 residents that just happen to live in this space. And so while we have these other systems, like they have a council member and they have county commissioners, and they have these other governmental leadership that do invest and are responsive, what I feel my job is every day is to keep it very focused on these are the things that make it better for the community, they make it better for business, they make it better for the people. And so the bike plan for me was actually a deviation from my background in community development, because we think about multimodal in these very dense neighborhoods. And literally when I started my job, it was that the neighborhood was so old we didn't have sidewalks in places, or we're discussing open ditch as the best option to move water because there are no immediate options right now to keep high water out. And then we're talking about, bike paths for us, it's not going to be a number of users. It's not going to be a density piece. I think for us, it's almost the equivalent of going to say, we want to preserve some neighborhood character. We understand there's a rail and there's going to be density, but we want to give the opportunity to retain these very large bikeways and allow, or streets, pardon, and allow for bikeways and other transportation to move with it. And we know that it's going to be the younger kids that are going to get on the bike, you know, however you define yourself as a younger kid. And we want to connect the schools. And to your point, you know, we want to even connect like the pharmacies. Like, could you get to the pharmacy or the grocery store and get home? So all of these things are moving for us, I think, in a faster pace than the number of users of bikes that we have on the street. But we know collectively that this is a value that the neighborhood has, both businesses and residents. And that's how, again, the best advantage is I can represent the values locally as we look for these infrastructure and we advocate, like, with so many things that you need, this is the thing that we want first.
Makes sense. And I'll piggyback and totally agree. It's about layered stewardship, you know, and I think of it like an onion, right? So we're the closest part to the middle, to the people, to the seed, to the core, and we get to influence how certain things are implemented. We don't control it because many management districts don't own land. And so we don't control it, it's public. But what we can do is influence and guide, you know, what gets set as a priority through our partnerships with our, you know, tax increment reinvestment zones. We get to advocate for what's best. And it comes from the people, it comes from the businesses, it comes from the end user every single day. Whether, you know, many of the people that, you know, come in and do a lot of the engineering and things like that, they don't live in the neighborhood. And so, you know, although this may work out in the suburbs, it may not work here. So we have to be kind of at the forefront of saying, hey, no, this is great, but it's not going to work here because the user here does not speak that same level of modality, does not have that level of need, and be able to advocate for that in a way that's equitable, that looks at how we can best, you know, increase the vitality of the built environment, how people live, work, and play in an area that is, you know, may be limited in one area, but really robust in another. So we have a unique opportunity to be creative, to be strategic, but to really be forward thinking and innovative, you know, 1 mile, 1 square mile at a time, or one neighborhood at a time, and really having the advantage of, you know, the city of Houston doing complete communities and us looking at bike plans and all these overlays. You know, that's kind of the joy of my day, is like, what's happening next? What do we need to overlay next? But really taking that and using that to our advantage to serve, right? And to really service the communities and people very well by being those stewards and being those frontline advocates that, you know, support that layered approach. So I just think we have an advantage because we have the opportunity to serve and to steward these things.
So we're talking a lot about access to infrastructure, but what about just access to bicycles themselves? So you have a lot of low-income people in any community. There is bike share and there are programs that will get used bicycles into the hands of people who need them. But are there things in Houston that are exciting you about broadening the access to bicycles themselves that are happening now?
I think Houston Bike Share is taking a good approach to their Go Pass program, which provides equitable access to the underbanked. The goal is it's a reduced membership. I think it's like $3 a month for unlimited rides versus the $13 a month for, you know, those who are not economically disadvantaged, you know, to a certain degree. But I also look at, you know, Bike Houston and the education components and the relationships, and, you know, some of the things we're looking at as it relates to, you know, membership and what that looks like, because inclusion and in being invited are two different things. And so our goal is to make sure that people are not just invited, but they are included. And, you know, access to bikes, you know, that's something that is, you know, the average person may or may not know that you can get a bike, you know, for little of nothing. But because we see biking as a recreational activity, you know, we're thinking of these, you know, high dollar, you know, MS 150 type, you know, Cadillacs, whereas somebody just needs to get from, you know, 3 miles down the road, you know, to their job, or a kid needs to get home from their school. So when we talk about access to biking and the use of, you know, actual bikes, that's a work in progress. And I think that with good partnerships, it's something that can be, handled universally. But I'm utopian sometimes, but I think that we can get bikes to people who need bikes.
I think it's good to be a utopian no matter where you live, doing the work that we all do. We all have a vision for how we want our streets to look and who they will serve and all the rest. So I think that's a good one, and a good transition to maybe some questions that we've gotten from people. We've talked a little bit about sort of just educating drivers about the infrastructure itself. And you were, Veronica, talking about the driver who went into a path because it had been a driving lane before. There's it's more of a comment from Rhonda Harrison Benjamin, who says, Houston becoming bike friendly is a massive driver education program with teens and other newly licensed drivers prior to becoming licensed, and a funded public relations campaign. It's basically saying the city's so car centric that forget about the infrastructure. Drivers don't understand sometimes that bikes have as much of a right to the road as they do. What can be in the works? Bill, I think, like, what campaigns have you seen nationally? The league does a lot of education stuff and partners with people. What's working in other cities to move that forward?
Yeah, I think, from the bicycle friendly community applications that Houston fills out, they've been a bronze level, which is, the base level, since 2013, and still sitting there at bronze, but, making progress. But one of the standout things was actually that most schools in Houston don't have like just bicycling education accessible for students. And I think as you're thinking about, people will be driving cars, I think, bicycling education and, let's just say, mobility education is part of what Houston should be thinking of when you're trying to make, again, those good drivers that sort of have the empathy, like, oh, I do that sometimes. I did that. Bicycling isn't a special thing. It's just like a thing that you can do to get around. You don't have to wear these kinds of clothes. You don't have to, you don't have to go on a 100-mile ride. You can just, bike to the store, things like that. I think that's sort of a systematic way of approaching this, and just giving everybody that kind of experience, and just as part of that to have that narrative that, hey, Houston, the mayor said that there's this paradigm shift. We together are doing this. You have a great director of transportation. You have all these people in the right places. We have to build the political will. And the way you do that is have people experience biking, right? To do this stuff, that it's not a special thing. It's not a nice to have. It's like it's a need to have. And I think bicycling education is a really big part of that.
Zabe, did you want to add to that? I feel like, you do so much with showing cities what their streets can look like, sort of what the design guidelines can be. What do you think in terms of the education piece?
I think that's a good component, and it's certainly something that will help people to understand what's available to them. But I truly believe that the best education is actually putting things on the ground, right? If you put something on the ground that looks inviting, that looks safe, and actually goes where people want to go, you pair that with an education program, sure, but people still have to see that this is a thing. Like you're saying, Bill, you have to build it. So I think it's important to make sure that people see high quality, and high comfort bike facilities. I also think it's important to show that you're making the other changes that need to go along with that. And I hate to bring it back to policy, but you're talking about a 50-mile-an-hour street with a bike lane on it, and I am horrified, right? So how do we make that street slower? Obviously, we have to think about design solutions, but we also have to think about lowering our speed limits on streets that really just should not be operating like that. And that is a benefit to cyclists for sure, but it's a benefit to transit riders, it's a benefit to pedestrians, and it's a benefit to drivers. It's a benefit to drivers who aren't dying on streets, but also it's a benefit to not having the trauma of killing someone. Yes. These are very basic things, but we forget about the power of simply putting something good on the street and making it useful to people.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can think of 100 examples in my neighborhood where we debated something for quite literally years, and nobody was going to use it. It's going to ruin the neighborhood. And then we put it in, and you see a child biking down the street, or an elderly person sitting on a bench that everyone said was going to ruin the business in front. So yeah, I think just getting stuff done. Sometimes we like to talk a lot. But I think sometimes just getting stuff done is really, like you said, the best education. So we have another question for our Houston panelists from Ken. And we touched on it a little bit, but it would be great to dive in. How can Houston better leverage our growing world-class bike path network? And what Ken says is he suggests a grid of high comfort visible bike lanes that make access to the paths easier. What work, we talked about it a little bit, but what work is going on to really connect? These are great assets for a city to have. What's going on to connect them?
Well, and Nikki, do you want to start with some of the work in your neighborhood?
Sure, I can. So the work that's going on to connect them is really talking to the end user, one, but also working with the city, because the city has a joint effort with Harris County Precinct 1. And the bike plan is a aggressive rollout for, for lack of a better word, of getting bike lanes onto, neighborhood streets, and to really look at leveraging what exists and how to enhance them. One of the I guess the concerns as it relates to the rollout is, maintenance and how frequently things are maintained, how to make sure that the existing bike lanes or facilities complement the new ones. And so, that conversation then segues back to equity, right? So to leverage that is really a larger conversation and continual conversation on how do we put facilities in, but keep them relevant, keep them safe, keep them well maintained, well lit, and accessible in a way that allows people to welcome that growth and expansion. And like Zabe said, sometimes it has to go down in order for people to see the value. But if it goes down and it's not maintained, is the value really what it says it's going to be? So it's a multifaceted approach, and I hope I'm answering the question, but I think that, in order for us to leverage and expand and to look at this thing long term, we have to consider all components.
No, I think you did answer the question. And what comes to mind for me is that a lot of times bike lanes do get put in and the city pats itself on the back for putting in X miles of bike lanes per year. And then the next day they're all parked with cars, or the paint has faded and no one's using it. And then that brings up other equity concerns, like you said, because the reporting mechanisms for please repaint this bike lane usually are tech heavy. We see all these stats that say like this neighborhood wants better maintained bike lanes. It's like, yeah, because that's where all the tech workers live and they have time to go on to 311 or your reporting mechanism. So I think that keeping that equity component, that's the outreach never ends, right? It never ends. Yeah, and it shouldn't. I also wanted to bring up a question about parking. I'm a nerd for bike parking. I think it is the key that unlocks cycling as a reliable tool, almost as much as a safe place to ride. You have to be confident that when you go into the grocery store, your bike is going to be there when you come out, or when you leave it at your job for 8 hours or more, it's going to be there and you'll be able to get home. So what efforts are you seeing in Houston? Are there policy level things that really we require parking in all new development in basically every city in the United States. How do we guarantee and require secure bike parking at the same level we consider car parking? Anybody?
None of us know how to answer this question, really.
Yeah, well, I know that you have a parking ordinance in Houston, like a bike parking ordinance for new developments. And I know that you can supplement, if you're a development, you can supplement you don't have to put in so much car parking, you can put in bike parking instead. I totally agree with you, Doug. I just want to say, I totally agree with you. I feel like it's like the least talked about, most important thing is bike parking. So I think, I'll just say from
after this, I think it's going to be about bike parking.
it's got to be about bike, but showing, I think it's part of that, like, put it there, as Abby said, like, it's like the bike lane. Maybe it's like a demonstration project is another way to show people, like, hey, this is how this population center gets to this place. But another thing you have to show them is that there's a place to park that's not like behind the building next to a dumpster or something, which is like, I know many of you who are probably listening or, have experienced this, like where you have to park your bike, even in bicycle friendly communities. I'll just say that, it's still one of those things that's forgotten.
I was just gonna say, we're still trying to figure out where to put cars that that come and keep, the cars away from the bikes. So yeah, bike parking is, thank you for adding something new to the list. I appreciate you all.
Sorry to make your job harder. My
Well,
job
No,
is
this
to get
is the
anyone
work.
fired or make
It's the
their
great
job
work.
harder. So
It's the great work. No worries.
I'll just say that there are good examples out there that you could look at in your business improvement districts that show that, when you sort of welcome people to bike to those neighborhoods and to those businesses, that it's more attractive, for people to like, oh wow, I can bike there. I definitely know in my town where there's good bike parking, where there are tabletops that I can like do my outside office space. All that stuff is like in my mind within a 4-mile radius of my home. And so I think it's an amenity.
It is. I appreciate that.
And we'll take one more that are sort of a combination of two questions. Veronica and Nikki, you are like real champions for your districts, for your communities, and it sounds like they're very lucky to have both of you doing what you do. But at the same time, like, you have to prioritize what you don't have unlimited resources. And so you do have to prioritize what goes where and what types of facilities go where. In building your bike plans for your district, what criteria are you using to prioritize what gets built? Whether it's a protected lane. Zabe mentioned, that 50-mile-an-hour arterial, like, you don't necessarily want sharrows on there, right? And you're going to have to do a lot more than just put in a bike lane and call it a day. Like, how are you prioritizing this stuff? And I think we can probably zoom out nationally from there, because Bill and Zabe they have established criteria in lots of cities for these things.
I mean, we look at NACTO. So Zabe, I mean, we just say, do what they say, most of the time. I mean, there's really good guidance out there. So everybody should know that in the room. I'll just say this, there's great guidance. NACTO has been a leader, FHWA, so the Federal Highway Administration. So the organization in Washington has put out really good guidance and how to make that sort of default facility. So, I'll let Zabe, who's a professional.
I will say, as an advocate, I am frequently screenshotting stuff from the guides that Zabe and her colleagues have put together, and sending it to my local elected officials and saying, it could look like this, So, yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to continue on with the national view since we went there first. I think there are a lot of ways to make this work. I think one of the components, again, is make everything the default. Again, like, figure out, what does your street design look like? What does your standard for your street designs look like? And how can you include things in that standard that make it, again, the default, so that you have to get a variance to not include it rather than to figure out how to include it. When it comes to sort of figuring out how to distribute need, once you've established what the actual project is going to be, I think one thing is to look at need versus demand. A lot of our planning right now is demand-based planning. It's either explicitly so in the numbers, because it focuses on how many numbers are agglomerated here, or what the future growth trend is going to be, or even demand in terms of people responding and sending in petitions or calling their counselors or what have you. None of those are about need. That's just what the future holds, or what other people are literally demanding. So making sure that we understand not just how things are performing in terms of the street itself, or access, or presence of bike parking or what have you, but by neighborhood, by ethnicity, by car dependency or not. What are the different ways that we're slicing and dicing the data we already have that tries to get at understanding need. And the final thing that I'll say on this specific topic is, equity is not just outreach. And this is like one of my pet peeves, because a lot of people think, well, if we just want to have an equitable plan, then we'll go and talk to different people. And that is really critical, as I've said before, but that's getting at the people that you're hearing from and sort of testing the waters in that way. That is not the same as understanding what the baseline need is and making sure that your work plan in and of itself is equitable. Those are very different things. They're both important, but you have to make sure you do the other side too. And I think that is something that, quite honestly, is lacking in a lot of places, and people are just starting to layer in equity into the baseline work plan for all of their CIPs and other sorts of like long range and short-term planning.
And I'll give Veronica and Nikki like 30 seconds and then we'll wrap it up. You guys get the last word since it's your hometown.
So we're striving to do it right. We're weighing that with all of the other things and projects we have on the board to change the world. And we're going to come and ask y'all for money. And the money is an investment in the neighborhood. It's not an investment in me. It's not an investment in the building I sit in. It's an investment in the 75,000 people that live between downtown Houston and the port.
Well said. I echo those sentiments, except instead of 16 square miles of money asking, it'll be 30. But no, safety is first. We want safety and we want people to have a quality of life that they can rave about. And people say, why do you love your city? Or why do you love your district? Why do you love your area? It's because people care. They care about my well-being. They care about, if I can make a living here, if I can be safe here, if I can take my children outside. It's about a quality of life and it's about the opportunity to serve. So that's the primary goal, is to make sure we're serving people well.
That's a great message to end on. Bill, Zabe, Veronica, Nikki, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody watching for your questions. Yeah, check out the NACTO guide, everybody. It is like invaluable. I use it all the time. Join the league if you haven't, support your districts, give them the money they need to build the stuff that they want, and donate to Bike Houston as well, because they're sponsoring all of this. So yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm gonna hand it over to Carter Stern, who's the chair of the board.
Hey, everybody. My name is Carter Stern. I'm chair of Bike Houston board. I want to first thank Bill, Doug, Zabe, Veronica, and Nikki. Other than Nikki, I know all of you because I am a huge bike and transportation nerd. You guys do not know me. But it brings me a lot of joy to see advocates from outside the city of Houston coming in to share their knowledge and help us live up to our potential. I think Houston is a city of the future, no matter how you slice it. We are a post-World War II Sunbelt city, which is grappling with all the challenges and the opportunities that presents. And I think that we have an amazing opportunity here to really show the path forward, standing on the shoulders of advocates and policymakers who have come before us. And Bill, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of great work that has been done, a lot of thought leadership. But when you get down to it, and this may be because this is what my day job is, but a lot of it is just politics, right? Like, we need to build up this advocacy muscle to advocate for what we know is right, for what we know is good policy, to keep our neighborhoods safe, to make them equitable and accessible. And it's not going to happen without organizations like Bike Houston and our amazing new, I guess he's not quite new anymore, but our new ED, Joe Cutrufo. And so that is Doug laid the groundwork, but this is a shameless plug for support. We need your support. I think we have an amazing year ahead of us and beyond. And I'm so excited about what we're going to accomplish. And so I hope you will consider donating to Bike Houston. You can go to bikehouston.org for more information. Please reach out to any of us, either on staff or board, if you have any questions. But thank you for joining us here today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Doug. I follow you on Twitter and like all the stuff that you do, and I'm smarter for it. And with that, I'll close this out. Joe, I don't know if you have anything else, but thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Carter. Appreciate it.
All right, that sounds like that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.